The lecture you're about to watch is one in a series about governance for development in Africa. Governance for Development in Africa is an initiative undertaken jointly by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation and SAWAS School of Oriental and African Studies in London. What we hope here is to help create a debate about governance in Africa, to help raise awareness and knowledge. And for that purpose, we have sponsored this series of lectures. I hope you enjoy the lecture and have fun. Thank you.
I'm Mushtaq Khan. I'm a professor of economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, which is part of the University of London. My research interests are in institutional economics, which is a branch of economics which looks at how institutional structures and governance structures are important for economic development. I'm also interested in industrial policy and in the role of the state in economic development. And I've written and researched and worked on these areas for the last 20 years or so. I want to talk today about the relationship between governance reforms and the challenges that developing countries face in doing governance reforms and economic growth and development, because this has become an area of considerable controversy in developing countries and in the international community. Let's begin at the beginning. Governance is what states do. And clearly the state is an extremely important player in economic development. So if we mean by governance reforms that states have to become more efficient, then nobody can disagree with the importance of governance. I think all economists agree that you need governance capabilities in states to have economic development, welfare improvements, growth, and so on. The controversy really is twofold. First, what is it that states should be doing in poor countries to achieve growth and development? And there's a lot of controversy about that. And secondly, even if we agree that there are some things which states should be doing, there is a practical question about which of these reforms it is feasible to implement in particular countries, because even if in theory there are lots of things which are very important, we need to know that they can actually be done in a particular country. I'll talk today about a number of issues. Firstly, I'm going to explain that the conventional understanding of governance as it has developed, which is called the good governance agenda, tells developing countries that they have to do a number of things which their states need to have the capabilities of doing to achieve development. And these are well-known things like rule of law, anti-corruption, democratic accountability. And if you do these things, then your market economies will work better and you will have faster development, faster poverty reduction, and so on. The second thing I'm going to say is that this set of ideas is based on actually a very narrow understanding of economic theory and historical evidence. And if you look at broader economic theory and historical evidence, you actually see that while these are all very desirable things and developing countries want to achieve these things, they actually historically have been achievable at the end of a process of development and not at the beginning. In other words, they're not preconditions of development, they are things which are the goals of development. And we'll see some evidence for this, and we'll also look at some of the theoretical reasons why it's very difficult to implement these things at very early stages of development. And then I'll finally end up by saying that actually the good governance agenda frames the governance problem in a very misleading way. That actually what we need to be thinking about are the governance capabilities that developing countries need to achieve and can achieve in the short to medium term, based on the experience of successful developers, mostly in East Asia, but also historically, so that they can eventually achieve all these good governance things that are clearly extremely desirable, like democracy and anti-corruption and a good rule of law and so on. So I think there's a very important and very fundamental misreading of both history and theory going on, and it is telling developing countries to do things which are actually unachievable and we are using up a lot of our very limited reform resources and capabilities in barking up trees which we can't actually climb. So let me begin by saying what is the good governance agenda and where it's coming from. Well, we all know by now, particularly in Africa, that there's a whole set of things which countries are supposed to be doing: democratic accountability and anti-corruption policies and rule of law. Where are these ideas coming from? Well, they're actually coming from a particular branch of economic theory which says that to achieve economic development, you need to achieve well-working markets. To have well-working markets, you need to have well-defined and stable property rights, because markets are basically contractual arrangements where people exchange things and write contracts which are enforceable. Now, if you have to have contracts which are enforceable, you need to have stable property rights, which means property rights which can be protected, and a good rule of law so that contracts which are written about these property rights can actually be enforced. This is really the starting point of what I call the mainstream good governance agenda. Now, if you have to have these enforceable contracts and property rights, what kind of state do you need? And the argument is you need a state which is capable of protecting property rights. So you have to do a lot of rule of law reforms. You have to strengthen your court system. You also have to have a state which can be protected from the interests of small groups of people who want to subvert the state using corruption. So you have to then have a strong anti-corruption agenda which protects the state from bribes and influence. And to achieve that, the argument goes, you also need to have democratic accountability, because corruption and privilege and patron-client politics only benefit small groups of people. So if you can have a really mass-based democracy where the majority has significant political power, so the theory goes, you will also be able to fight corruption. So all of the things that we talk about as part of the good governance agenda, which is democratic accountability, anti-corruption, and rule of law, and a number of other associated things which I won't go into, are all connected in terms of driving the creation and achievement of efficient markets. This is really very important to understand, because what is being said is that if you don't have these things, you will not actually have efficient markets, and therefore you will not achieve development. Now, the problem is that, you see, everybody, including myself and most people in the audience, would agree that democratic accountability and anti-corruption and a rule of law are very desirable things to have. And we shouldn't confuse things which are desirable with things which are necessary to achieve development. In other words, we shouldn't confuse the means of achieving development with the goals or the ends of development. And what the good governance agenda, as it is understood, has actually done is it's done precisely that. It's telling us that all of these things which everyone agrees are the goals of development need to be achieved in very poor economies, because if they don't achieve these things, they're not going to get the efficient markets which will drive growth. That's the theory that we need to understand.